There is a number that archaeology refuses to explain. 5,000 years before the birth of Christ, in the hills of what is now Serbia, a group of humans lit a fire hot enough to liquefy stone. They did not stumble into this by accident. They did not experiment their way upward through centuries of failed attempts. They simply knew. And the world they produced from that fire would never be the same again. The standard model of human development is built on a comfortable lie. It tells us that civilization was earned, that technology was the hard-won prize of 10,000 generations of patient, fumbling ingenuity. It tells us that the sword came from the knife, that the knife came from the flint, and that the flint came from desperate hands in the dark. Historians call this gradualism, and they repeat it so often it has calcified into fact. But the ground beneath Serbia does not agree, and neither does the ground beneath Bulgaria, and neither, if you look closely enough, does any piece of soil from the Levant to the Caucasus that was disturbed around 4,700 years before the Common Era. Because what archaeologists keep pulling out of that earth does not look like evolution. It looks like an injection. The site at Belovode on Rudnik Mountain in Serbia contains the oldest securely dated evidence of high-temperature copper smelting on Earth, verified to approximately 5,000 BC. Not elementary copper hammering, which any Neolithic population might have stumbled into. High-temperature reductive smelting, which requires an understanding of thermal dynamics, atmospheric chemistry, and ore selection that the prevailing timeline insists no human of that era could have possessed. And yet, they possessed it, fully formed, functional, as though the knowledge arrived complete. 300 kilometers west, at a site the modern world knows as the Varna necropolis in Bulgaria, the anomaly intensifies to something approaching the surreal. The necropolis dates to between 4750 and 4347 BC, and within its 294 graves, researchers found objects that should not exist. Not primitive trinkets, not crude experiments. Immense, sophisticated quantities of refined gold and copper, cast and worked with a precision and abundance that implies an entire industrial infrastructure behind it, an infrastructure whose evolutionary precursor has never been found, because it does not exist in the record. There was no precursor. There was a before, and then there was the Varna necropolis, and between them there is only silence and a question that conventional archaeology has no answer for. A century earlier, in the published literature, if you raised this anomaly in polite academic company, you were handed the standard explanations: local innovation, environmental catalysts, parallel development. But the discovery at Pločnik, another Serbian site, drove a fracture straight through the gradualist model that has never fully healed. At Pločnik, researchers recovered a tin-bronze foil, a sophisticated alloy dated to approximately 4650 BC. Tin-bronze. The material, civilization's textbooks credit the Near East with developing around 2500 BC. Europe, according to the official timeline, should not have had tin-bronze for another 2,000 years, and yet there it was, buried in the Balkan soil, waiting to be discovered like a message from a sender history has erased. These are not marginal data points. They are the archaeological record's way of screaming. What the record cannot tell you, because archaeology deals only in physical residue, is who taught them. But another category of source material can, and it is far older and far stranger and far more specific than any dig site. In the Second Temple tradition of ancient Judaism, preserved in a body of texts that did not make it into the standardized canon. There is a document that has been carried in fragments across 2 millennia of theological suppression and scholarly dismissal. It is called First Enoch, and it is, depending on your interpretive framework, either the most elaborate mythological allegory ever written or the most damning technological deposition in human history. Because within its 8th chapter, embedded in a sentence that most readers pass over on their way to the more colorful prophecies, is a statement of almost clinical precision. Azazel taught men to make swords and knives and shields and breastplates, and made known to them the metals of the earth and the art of working them. Read that slowly, not as poetry, as a technical curriculum. The entity identified as Azazel, one of 200 beings collectively termed the Watchers or the Grigori in the Enochian literature, descended to the summit of Mount Hermon during a period the text places in the days of Jared, several generations before the flood. The Watchers were not a disorganized mob. The texts are meticulous on this point. They were organized, hierarchical, and each was responsible for a distinct category of forbidden knowledge. Some transferred pharmaceutical data, root cuttings, and botanical formulations. Others transferred astronomical knowledge. But Azazel's curriculum was singular, consistent, and unmistakably industrial. He was not a spirit of temptation or a theological abstraction. He was an engineer. To understand the sheer weight of this intervention, you need to sit with a detail the texts make explicit, but that modern readers tend to glide past. Azazel did not teach concepts. He taught parameters. He transferred the precise thermal and chemical knowledge required to convert raw, unprocessed ore into functional metallurgical output. He handed a population of early humans the exact specifications for processes that, according to the mainstream timeline, those humans would not independently arrive at for centuries. That is not inspiration. That is a data transfer. And the Greeks, who preserved a parallel memory of this event through the figure of Prometheus, understood the stakes perfectly. When Aeschylus put words in Prometheus's mouth, the Titan did not boast of giving humanity fire as an abstract gift of light and warmth. He boasted of revealing the treasures beneath the earth, metals like bronze, iron, silver, and gold. The Greek mythological tradition preserved the same memory the Enochian texts preserve, because they were both recording the same catastrophic event. They just used different names for the engineer. What makes Azazel uniquely terrifying, as a historical figure rather than a theological one, is the absence of any ambiguity in his motive. He did not descend to help. He descended to break a quarantine. The Enochian texts frame the restrictions on technological transfer not as arbitrary divine jealousy, but as a containment protocol, a recognition that certain categories of knowledge, given to a species not yet psychologically equipped to handle them, would produce outcomes the cosmos itself could not absorb. Azazel understood the protocol. He had access to it. He broke it anyway. The question every person in this story eventually has to answer is not, what did he teach? We know what he taught. The question is, why? And the answer the Enochian tradition gives is one that the modern world, surrounded by the products of his curriculum, is perhaps the only civilization in history fully equipped to understand. He did not give humanity fire. He gave humanity the capacity to burn everything down. And the difference between those two things is something our species has been failing to grasp ever since the first furnace was lit in the hills of Serbia, 6,000 years before anyone thought to ask, who built it? The forge of Azazel didn't just change what humans could make. It changed what humans were. But to understand how completely it rewired the species, you need to understand what those first smiths were actually breathing. Because the technology Azazel transferred wasn't merely dangerous in the sociological sense. It was chemically, biologically, bodily, lethal. And the gods of every civilization that came after carried the scars to prove it. Here is something no mythology textbook will tell you directly, but that the mythologies themselves have been screaming for 3,000 years. The god of the forge, in every culture that built one, was broken. Not metaphorically, not symbolically. Physically, grotesquely, irreparably broken. Hephaestus, limping across Olympus while the other gods gleamed with athletic perfection. Vulcan, ugly and hobbled in a pantheon of marble beauty. Wayland the smith in the Germanic tradition, crippled and captive, forced to labor for a king who feared what a free version of him might build. The Finnish Ilmarinen, the Scandinavian Volunder, the Egyptian dwarf god Ptah Across 12 civilizations that never spoke to each other, never traded texts, never shared a theological tradition, the smith is always the same. He is always bent. He is always marked. Mythology scholars have spent centuries constructing elegant symbolic explanations for this universal archetype. The lame god represents the outsider, the creative genius alienated from society. The broken body is a metaphor for the dangerous power of craft. These interpretations are not wrong, exactly. They are just arriving at the symbol from the wrong direction. Because the lame smith is not a metaphor that became a god, he is a medical diagnosis that became a myth. The technology of Azazel's forge was not merely powerful. It was carcinogenic by design. Before the ancient world settled on tin to harden its copper, the dominant alloy of the early Bronze Age was arsenical bronze, and the word arsenical is not a descriptor added for historical color. It is a chemical reality that rewrote the bodies of every smith who worked it. To produce functional, hardened copper tools in the 3rd and 4th millennia BC, early metallurgists smelted copper ores that were contaminated with arsenic compounds, minerals like phalore, tennantite, and enargite. They also, as a study published in the journal Archaeological confirmed through analysis of remains at Elephantine Island in Egypt, deliberately introduced spice into their processes. Spice is a toxic, slag-like alloy dense with arsenic, iron, and lead, and the smiths of the Middle Kingdom were not using it accidentally. They were using it as an intentional reagent to elevate the arsenic content of their blades and thereby harden the cutting edge. This was not ignorance. This was calculated, deliberate, occult chemistry. They knew what spice was. They added it on purpose. And the vaporized arsenic it released into the forge atmosphere entered the bodies of everyone in proximity and began its work. Chronic arsenic exposure produces a progression of symptoms that reads like a catalog of divine punishment. First, severe dermatitis, the skin erupting and thickening in patches of hyperkeratosis that render the surface of the body strange and inhuman. Then, arsenical melanosis, dark discoloration spreading across the skin in patterns that would have looked, to anyone in the ancient world, like the mark of something supernatural. Then, at the terminal end of the exposure timeline, the nervous system begins to fail. Peripheral neuritis, the clinical term, describes the slow death of the nerves in the extremities, the loss of sensation followed by profound weakness, atrophy, the collapse of the muscles of the legs. The smith's body curves inward on itself. His gait becomes the lurching, compensatory movement of a man whose legs no longer fully belonged to him. Skeletal evidence from the site of Shikmim in Israel, dated to the 4th millennium BC, has identified individuals connected to metalworking through the extraordinarily elevated arsenic content deposited permanently in their bones. The forge did not just take years from these people. It left its chemical signature inside their skeletons, a record written in poison that persisted millennia after the flesh dissolved. They are still carrying the mark. This is what Hephaestus is, not a symbol, a memory, a precise, accurate cultural memory of what happened to the men who stood at Azazel's forge and breathed its air and came out the other side changed in ways that no god of healing could reverse. Every civilization that produced smiths produced a broken god to explain what it was watching, because what it was watching was genuinely inexplicable through any other framework available to the ancient mind. The smith went into the fire and came out maimed. Something was in the fire, something that cost the body its wholeness in exchange for the ability to produce weapons of unimaginable lethality. That trade, that terrible exchange, is the most honest theological statement the ancient world ever made about the nature of industrial power. But the arsenic in the bronze was only half of Azazel's curriculum. And the second half is where the story becomes something stranger and more sinister than a straightforward account of industrial poisoning. The 8th chapter of 1st Enoch is meticulous in the way it pairs its categories of corruption. It does not list weapons and then, separately, list cosmetics, as though they were two unrelated sins bundled together for convenience. It presents them as a unified transmission, a single package of forbidden knowledge with two surfaces: swords and knives and shields and breastplates, and then, immediately following, without pause or transition, bracelets and ornaments and the use of antimony, beautifying the eyelids, and all coloring tinctures. Modern readers tend to read this pairing as a moral statement about vanity and violence, the ancient author grouping material corruption with spiritual corruption. But that reading misses the deeper, more disturbing truth, which is that the pairing is not moral. It is chemical. The sword and the eyelid paint share the same forge. Kohl, the heavy black cosmetic ubiquitous across the ancient Near East and Egypt, the substance that lined the eyes of pharaohs and priests and the women of every court from the Levant to Mesopotamia, was produced from two primary sources. The first was galena, lead sulfide, a mineral that when processed yields a fine, lustrous black powder. The second was stibnite, antimony trisulfide, a lead-gray metallic mineral found in hydrothermal environments whose chemical breakdown requires the exact same high-temperature processing that arsenical bronze production demands. Stibnite is 71.4% antimony by weight. To render it into a cosmetic powder usable on human skin, you need to thermally break it down under conditions that only a mature metallurgical operation can produce. The same fire that hardened the blade produced the poison for the face. The same furnace, the same operator, the same forbidden thermodynamics. The refining of these toxic heavy metal sulfides was not separable from weapons production. It was the other side of the same industrial process. And the lead and antimony that resulted from it were being pressed directly onto the skin, into the delicate tissue around the eyes, where they were absorbed through contact and carried into the bloodstream in quantities that, over a lifetime of application, produced chronic heavy metal toxicity, plumism, systemic cognitive degradation. The cosmetics were weapons with a longer fuse. There is something inside this arrangement that feels too precise to be accidental. Because what Azazel introduced to the human species through his combined metallurgical curriculum was not merely a set of tools. It was a complete reprogramming of human self-perception. Before the Chalcolithic, a human being could only see their own face in still water. The polished metal mirror, another product of the same advanced cupellation and refining processes Azazel transferred, changed that entirely. For the first time in the history of the species, the individual human being could study their own face in sharp, sustained detail. And the cosmetics that arrived alongside the mirror gave them the technology to alter it, to construct a performed self, a curated surface designed to project power and beauty and dominance. The mirror and the sword are not coincidentally paired in the Enochian literature. They are identified as twin instruments of the same mutation. One gave the individual ego a mechanism to enforce its supremacy over other bodies through violence. The other gave it a mechanism to construct and project its supremacy through image. They are, together, the foundational technology of every system of individual power that humanity has built since. Every court, every hierarchy, every empire that rose on the idea that certain people were simply more than others, more beautiful, more powerful, more worthy of survival, descends from this moment, from this forge, from this specific, calculated package of corruption delivered to a species that had not yet developed the psychological architecture to survive it. And the earth itself had a name for what Azazel was doing to it, a name that the ancient world remembered even when it had forgotten everything else. Because there is a tradition, preserved by the anthropologist and historian of religion Mircea Eliade in his 1956 work, The Forge and the Crucible, that documents how every pre-metallurgical society on Earth understood the ground beneath their feet. The Earth was not dead matter, it was a living body. Specifically, it was a mother, Terra Mater, the Earth Mother, and the ores and minerals buried within it were her embryos, gestating toward eventual ripening in geological time, slowly maturing over centuries and millennia toward gold and higher states of pure matter. Mining, under this cosmology, was not extraction, it was violence. Tearing unripened embryos from a living womb. Smelting was worse. It was forcing a gestational metamorphosis through torture, using fire to do in hours what natural time would require ages to accomplish. The smiths who performed these acts were not respected craftsmen in the communities that first confronted them. They were figures of profound, supernatural dread, dark magicians who had learned to violate the body of the world itself, to rip its unborn children from it, and torture them into new shapes. Eliade documents the sacrifices that accompanied early furnace operations across Africa and Europe, including, in some traditions, human sacrifice, not from bloodlust, but from terror. The act required propitiation. The earth that was being violated was understood as capable of retribution. You did not just light a smelting fire, you paid for it, in blood, in ritual, in the acknowledgement that what you were doing was fundamentally transgressive, a violation of a boundary that the cosmos had drawn for a reason. This is the theological memory of Azazel's intervention, encoded not in a single text, but in the ritual practices of dozens of cultures that never shared a common origin. The forge was demonic. The fire was forbidden. The transformation it produced was a horror disguised as a gift. And the human bodies that worked the furnaces paid the biological price for wielding celestial power in the most literal way possible. The lame gods were their memorial. But the individual cost to the smiths who breathed the arsenic and the lead was only the first tremor of what was coming. Because Azazel's technology did not stay in the forge, it walked out into the world, into the hands of the men who controlled it. And those men did what every human being does when given power they cannot fully understand. They used it to restructure everything around them in their own image. And what the world looked like after they finished, what the Enochian texts and the Dead Sea Scrolls preserve in fragments that archaeology is only now beginning to confirm, is something so complete, so total in its violence and its strangeness, that the civilization which emerged from the other side of the flood would spend the next 6,000 years trying to rebuild what was destroyed, without ever quite agreeing on what it was. Before the flood, before the water came and reset the ledger, there was a world, not a primitive world, not a world of scattered tribes fumbling through darkness with stone tools and animal skins. A world with an industrial base, a military hierarchy, a ruling class that had monopolized celestial technology and used it to restructure every relationship between human beings and the earth they stood on. A world that looked, if you hold the fragments together long enough to see the shape of them, disturbingly familiar. The sociological collapse that followed Azazel's technological transfer did not unfold slowly. It did not require centuries of gradual stratification. The archaeological record from the late Chalcolithic and early Bronze Age shows a transition so rapid and so complete that researchers studying it reach for words like rupture and explosion before settling uncomfortably on development. At Arslantepe in eastern Anatolia, one of the sites where the material evidence of this transformation is most clearly preserved, the record shows the sudden emergence of public buildings and palace complexes organized specifically around the monopolization of metal weapons. Before the Bronze, these structures did not exist. After the Bronze, they dominated the settlement. The technology did not follow the hierarchy. The hierarchy followed the technology. Whoever controlled the arsenical bronze monopoly controlled everything else: the food supply, the labor pool, the reproductive futures of every individual within reach. The masters of fire became, within a generation or two, the first warlords, and the logic that drove them was not ambition in any recognizable human sense. It was something colder. It was the inexorable arithmetic of a species handed an asymmetric advantage and given no ethical framework capable of constraining it. Genesis 6, verse 11, does not editorialiate or moralize when it describes the terminal state of this world. It simply states, "The earth was filled with violence." But the biblical text is spare. It gives you the conclusion without the evidence. For the evidence, you have to go to the Dead Sea Scrolls. Among the manuscripts recovered from the caves at Qumran between 1947 and 1956, fragments of a text known as the Book of Giants survived in Aramaic. Multiple manuscript copies, designated in the scholarly literature as 1Q23, 2Q26, 4Q203, 4Q530, 4Q531, and 6Q8, preserve pieces of a narrative that the canonical tradition suppressed entirely. This is not a text about angels descending and producing mythological offspring as a theological parable. It is a text about what happens to a civilization that has been flooded with technology it cannot govern. The offspring of the Watchers, described in the Book of Giants, the Nephilim, the Giborim, the ones the text also calls giants, are depicted not as mindless brutes roaming the landscape, but as an apex predator class operating within a fully militarized societal structure. They have names. They have a hierarchy among themselves. They communicate, deliberate, and in some fragments, they begin to understand what is coming for them. The Qumran fragments preserve the names of specific warlord figures, Oya, Haya, Mahaway, and in one extraordinary preservation of cultural memory, Gilgamesh himself, the hero of Mesopotamia's oldest surviving epic, appears in the fragmentary Aramaic as one of the ruling Nephilim class, which reframes the entire Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the foundational texts of human literature, as something far stranger than a hero's journey. It frames it as the autobiography of a warlord born from a forbidden union, ruling a world already condemned. Fragment 4. Q531 is among the most explicit pieces of textual evidence for the scale of the ecological and biological devastation the Antediluvian arms race produced. The fragment links the Nephilim directly to the total corruption of the terrestrial biosphere, the defilement of species boundaries, the systematic harvest of animal and earthly resources at a scale that the natural world could not sustain. Another fragment, from the 1Q23 series, preserves what reads as a supply manifest: 200 donkeys, 200 asses, 200 rams of the flock, 200 goats, 200 beasts of the field, a list of consumption so vast it implies an industrial extraction operation rather than a subsistence economy. This was not a civilization feeding itself. It was a civilization feeding a machine. The flood, understood through this lens, was not a punishment. It was a quarantine protocol. The cosmos had watched the contamination spread through the terrestrial biosphere, watched the celestial technology propagate through the food chain and the social structure and the genetic record, and determined that the only intervention capable of containing it was total systemic reset. The waters did not come because humanity was wicked in any simple moral sense. They came because the runaway chain reaction Azazel had initiated by his unauthorized data transfer had reached a threshold that the natural order could not absorb. The flood was not God's anger. It was the immune system of the universe, responding to an infection that had spread too far. But here is the detail that every account of the flood consistently underemphasizes. The water stopped, and the technology did not drown with the world that built it. Because embedded in the physical landscape surrounding the Enochian epicenter, surrounding Mount Hermon itself, the textual descent point of Azazel and the 200 Watchers, there are structures that the flood did not erase, that no flood could erase. Because whoever built them was working at a scale that makes the question of natural disaster essentially irrelevant. 3 structures. In the foundations of what the Romans would later call the Temple of Jupiter at Baalbek, in what is now Lebanon, situated within the geographical shadow of Mount Hermon, sit 3 stones. They are called the Trilithon. Each of them weighs between 800 and 1,000 tons. They are fitted against each other with a precision that modern engineers, using modern tolerances, struggle to explain. The joints between them are not the approximate fits of primitive construction. They are near-zero tolerance assemblies, surfaces matched against each other with an accuracy that implies either machining or a technique of stone manipulation that produced equivalent results. And the mainstream archaeological explanation for who built them, which assigns the upper temple structure to the Romans around 60 AD, or to Herod the Great, consistently sidesteps the foundational megaliths themselves, because the foundational megaliths do not belong to any civilization the historical record names. There are similar anomalies distributed across the geographical range associated with the Watchers' activity. Polygonal masonry of inexplicable precision appearing in multiple continents. Cyclopean wall constructions whose individual components exceed any lifting or transport capacity that primitive human labor, using documented ancient tools, could have achieved. These are not mysteries that archaeology has solved and simply not communicated clearly to the public. They are active anomalies in the record, structural evidence of a technological capacity that has no evolutionary precursor in the official timeline. The same absence that characterizes the archaeological metallurgical record at Belovode and Varna. Something built at a scale humans had no business building at. Something worked stone with a precision that implies a tool which is not in the record. And there is, in the deepest strata of rabbinic and esoteric tradition, a memory of exactly that tool. The Talmudic tractates Sota 48b and Gittin 68a both describe the same object, an entity called the Shamir, referenced also in the pseudepigraphical Testament of Solomon, a legendary technology used to cut the hardest stones with perfect precision without the use of iron. The prohibition on iron is significant. The texts are explicit on this point. Iron was the metal of war, and therefore forbidden in sacred construction. The Shamir provided an alternative. It could split massive stone, the texts say, simply by being guided along a drawn path. It could cleave rock that no chisel could mark. And it had to be stored wrapped in wool, encased in lead, to prevent it from destroying its container. Pause on that detail. Wrapped in wool, encased in lead. Because that is not the description of a biological organism or a mystical artifact. That is the description of a radioactive or corrosive material being shielded against the environment and against its handlers. Lead shielding is not an ancient metaphor. It is a precise material choice, the same choice made in the 20th century when the first generation of nuclear engineers needed to store materials that emitted energy capable of destroying organic matter on contact. The ancients who described the Shamir and insisted it must be contained in lead were not reaching for poetic symbolism. They were describing a handling protocol. Stripped of the allegorical frame, the Shamir is a concentrated energy-emitting tool. The specific descriptions of its function, the ability to cleave hardest stone by proximity or by guidance along a marked line, correspond to nothing in the documented ancient toolkit. They correspond with uncomfortable precision to directed energy, to something functionally analogous to a laser or an isotopic cutter, a device that focuses and directs sufficient energy along a controlled path to ablate stone without mechanical contact. A tool that would leave no tool marks. A tool that would produce the kind of near-zero-tolerance surface fits visible in the foundational megaliths of Baalbek. A tool that, if it exists, has never been found, because its handlers understood exactly what it was and stored it accordingly. And when the civilization that owned it ended with them. This is what makes the Shamir the most terrifying relic in the Enochian tradition, not because it was powerful, though it clearly was, but because it represents the upper limit of what Azazel's technology could produce when fully developed. The arsenical bronze sword was the entry-level curriculum. The Shamir was the graduate program. It was the ultimate expression of the Watcher's industrial capacity, a tool that could reshape the face of the earth itself, that could move and carve and fit stone at a scale that made the difference between human construction and divine construction essentially invisible. And it was lost in the flood, or hidden from it, or carried forward through the survivors in a form that the subsequent civilization was not equipped to recognize. The traditions disagree on the specifics. They agree only that it existed, and that whatever it was, it could not be allowed to remain accessible. There is a detail in the Book of Giants that the scholarly literature treats as apocalyptic allegory, but that functions within the framework of this entire account as something closer to testimony. In several of the Qumran fragments, the Nephilim warlords begin to experience dreams. Premonitory dreams, disturbing and vivid, that they cannot interpret on their own. They send Mahaway, one of their number, as an emissary to Enoch, the one righteous man the tradition preserves from the Antediluvian era, to ask him what the dreams mean. And Enoch's answer, carried back by Mahaway across the distance, is not ambiguous. The dreams mean that the judgment is real. The contamination has been assessed. The quarantine protocol has been authorized. The Nephilim receive this information and know, with the clarity that only certainty of destruction produces, that what is coming cannot be negotiated with. They had inherited a world of unimaginable technological power. They had used it to strip the earth down to its bones. And now, the architect of the original quarantine was closing the last open door. What none of them could have known, what the flood itself could not prevent, was that the knowledge Azazel transferred did not die with the civilization it corrupted. It survived in the bones of the survivors, in the metallurgical memory of the species, in the deep structural logic of hierarchical organization that the warlord class had encoded into human social instinct over the course of the Antediluvian era. The water came, the water went, and the first thing the survivors built, when the ground was dry enough to stand on, was a forge. Because the fire, once learned, cannot be unlearned. And there is a straight line, unbroken and undeviating, from the first arsenic-choked smelting furnace in the hills of Serbia to the world that exists right now, at this exact moment, in every nation on earth. A line that Azazel drew 6,000 years before the Common Era, and that humanity has been extending ever since, always in the same direction, always toward the same terminus, always with the same absolute conviction that this time, this version of the celestial fire will be the one we finally learn to control. We haven't yet, but we keep believing we're about to. That belief, that specific, persistent, catastrophically expensive belief, is the last gift of the Watchers, and it may be the most dangerous thing they left us. In 1967, a historian sat down at his desk in Amenia, New York, and wrote a sentence that should have ended the argument. Lewis Mumford, 72 years old, a man who had spent 5 decades studying the relationship between human civilization and the machines it built, put down words that most of his contemporaries refused to sit with long enough to understand. He wrote that the first machine was not the wheel, it was not the plow, it was not the furnace, though the furnace came close. The first true machine, Mumford argued, was a human organization. It was a hierarchical structure of bodies, coordinated toward a single industrial purpose by a central authority that claimed divine sanction for its commands. He called it the Megamachine. And the moment you understand what he meant by that word, you cannot unknow it, because you will see it everywhere, in every era, in every civilization, running beneath the official histories like a river beneath a city, older than any of the institutions that draw from it. The pyramid at Giza required, by modern engineering estimates, somewhere between 20,000 and 100,000 workers, organized in rotating shifts, across an operational timeline of approximately 20 years, to produce a single object. That object serves no biological function. It stores nothing edible. It shelters no one from weather. It is a monument to the concentrated will of a single authority, executed through the total coordination of human bodies treated as interchangeable components in a mechanism. Those bodies were not slaves in the classical sense the popular imagination supplies. Archaeology and administrative records indicate that many were conscripted laborers, fed and housed by a state apparatus, moved and deployed according to logistical schedules of extraordinary complexity. They were components. The pyramid was the output. And the organizational structure that generated the output, the hierarchy of overseers and supervisors and administrators and priests and the pharaoh at the apex, who provided the theological justification for the entire enterprise, that structure was the machine. The stone was incidental. The machine was the point. Mumford's insight, which he developed across 2 volumes published as The Myth of the Machine, is that this organizational form, the Megamachine, did not originate with Egypt. Egypt was a particularly photogenic expression of it. The form itself was older. And if you follow Mumford's analysis backward through the archaeological record, it arrives, with an inevitability that he himself found disturbing, at precisely the moment and the geography that the Enochian texts identify as the origin point of celestial technological transfer. The Megamachine and the metallurgical revolution are not parallel developments that happened to coincide. They are the same event seen from 2 different angles. The technology required the hierarchy to control it. The hierarchy required the technology to enforce itself. And together they produced a feedback loop that has been running without interruption for 6,000 years. What Mumford could not have known, writing in 1967, was how completely the Qumran fragments would corroborate his structural analysis when they were fully examined and published in the subsequent decades. He was working from architectural evidence, from administrative records, from the internal logic of what large-scale coordinated production requires. He was not working from the Book of Giants. But the Book of Giants describes the Nephilim social structure in terms that map directly onto the Megamachine model. A ruling class that has monopolized a specific category of technological power. A subordinate population organized around the service and defense of that ruling class. A resource extraction operation conducted at industrial scale. An administrative hierarchy that assigns each body its function and enforces compliance through the asymmetric advantage of superior weapons. This is not mythology dressed up in sociological language. This is a blueprint. And it is the blueprint of every large-scale human civilization that has existed since. The Roman legions. The Han Dynasty's bureaucratic apparatus. The Spanish colonial enterprise in the Americas. The British East India Company. The Manhattan Project. The Pentagon's current global logistics infrastructure. These are not different machines. They are different instantiations of the same machine, updated and refined across 60 centuries of operation, inheriting and improving the organizational logic that the Antediluvian warlord class developed when they first realized that arsenical bronze gave them a permanent, asymmetric advantage over everyone else within reach. The Megamachine is Azazel's most durable product. More durable than any sword. More durable than any empire. Because empires are built inside it and dissolve back into it, and the machine itself continues. There is a specific moment in the 20th century where this becomes impossible to look away from. It is not the moment of the bomb's detonation over Hiroshima, though that moment is the most visible evidence of it. It is a moment that happened 3 years earlier, in a squash court beneath the west stands of Stagg Field at the University of Chicago, on the 2nd of December, 1942. That afternoon, a team of scientists assembled under the direction of Enrico Fermi achieved the first self-sustaining nuclear chain reaction in human history. They called the device Chicago Pile 1. It was a lattice of graphite and uranium assembled with rods of cadmium to control the rate of neutron absorption. When Fermi's team withdrew the control rods to the calculated critical point, the reaction went critical and held. For 4.5 minutes, the pile sustained a chain reaction that human beings had never produced before, and could not fully stop by any means then available to them. One of the scientists present, Arthur Compton, made a coded phone call to James Bryant Conant at Harvard. He said, in a sentence that has since become famous as the moment the modern world truly began, "The Italian navigator has just landed in the New World." The New World, in this metaphor, was a state of knowledge from which there was no return. They had crossed the threshold. They had achieved what Fermi himself, in a letter written years later, described as the release of atomic energy on a large scale. What Fermi's careful scientific language does not capture, but what every one of the people in that squash court understood, is that they had just demonstrated access to the energy that powers stars. They had taken the interior of the sun and built a small, temporary, controlled version of it in a basement in Chicago. And within 3 years, they would use that knowledge to vaporize 2 cities. The Shamir, the energy-emitting cutting tool of the Antediluvian tradition, stored in lead to prevent it from destroying everything it touched, produces a specific resonance when placed next to the Fermi reactor. Not because they are the same device, but because they are the same category of event. Both represent the moment a civilization accessed an order of energy so far beyond the biological scale that the containers required to handle it had to be designed from scratch, using materials selected specifically for their shielding properties. The lead encasing the Shamir was not ritual, it was physics. And the graphite and cadmium of Chicago Pile 1 were not merely engineering solutions. They were the modern world's answer to the same fundamental problem. How do you hold a fire that was never meant for human hands without burning everything down around you? The answer, in both cases, was the same. You build a machine around it. You create an organizational structure, a hierarchy of specialists, a chain of authority, a set of protocols and clearances and administrative procedures that mediates between the energy source and the population it could destroy. You build the Megamachine. And you tell yourself that this time, this version of the celestial fire is under control. Because the alternative, the acknowledgement that the energy you have accessed is fundamentally, categorically too large for the social architecture you have built to contain it, is a conclusion that no civilization in the history of the species has ever been able to sustain for long without collapsing under the weight of it. J. Robert Oppenheimer, the scientific director of the Manhattan Project, watched the first test detonation at the Trinity site in New Mexico on July 16, 1945, and recalled a line from the Bhagavad Gita, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." The line is famous enough to have become a cliché, but the part of Oppenheimer's response that history tends to underemphasize is what he said years later, in testimony and in private correspondence, about the nature of what the project had done to the people involved in it. He said that the physicists had known sin, not in a metaphorical sense, in the specific sense that they had done something irreversible to the category of human experience, that they had extended human reach into a domain whose consequences they could not fully calculate, and that the extension could not be retracted. They had taught what should not have been taught, to a species not yet equipped to survive the knowledge. If you have followed this account from its beginning, from the furnace-lit hills of Serbia 6,000 years before the Common Era, through the forge of Azazel and the arsenical bronze of the early smiths, and the toxic cosmetics of the ancient courts, and the Antediluvian arms race preserved in the Book of Giants, and the megaliths of Baalbek, and the energy-emitting tool stored in lead. You will recognize Oppenheimer's description. It is not a 20th century statement about nuclear physics. It is a 60-century-old confession, finally articulated in a language precise enough to hold its full weight. The physicists who stood at Trinity Site were standing at the same threshold the first smelters stood at in the Chalcolithic Balkans. They had accessed a category of power that the species had not developed the wisdom to manage before obtaining the capacity to wield it. And the only organizational response available to them was the one Azazel's original intervention had installed in the species. Build the Megamachine, assign the hierarchy, enforce the protocol, and hope that the math holds. It has held, so far. But the margin is not what the people running the machine prefer to advertise. The Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, a publication founded in 1945 by members of the Manhattan Project itself, maintains a symbolic clock measuring the proximity of global civilization to catastrophic destruction. It is called the Doomsday Clock. As of the most recent assessment before this account was recorded, the clock stood at 90 seconds to midnight, the closest it has ever been set in its entire history. Closer than it was during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Closer than it was during the height of the Cold War's nuclear standoff. The scientists who maintain it cited in their assessment not only the expansion of nuclear arsenals and the erosion of arms control agreements, but the broader convergence of existential risks, climate systems disrupted by industrial-scale resource extraction, biological threats accelerated by the same biotechnological knowledge transfer dynamics that the Enochian texts identified as a category of forbidden curriculum, and the emergence of artificial intelligence systems capable of autonomous operation at speeds and scales beyond human supervisory capacity. In other words, the Doomsday Clock is measuring the accumulated output of 6,000 years of the Megamachine. Every arrow points from Belovode. Every trajectory terminates in the same place. A civilization that has continuously expanded its capacity to produce catastrophic force, that has built organizational structures of enormous sophistication to manage that force, and that has never, at any point in the entire span of its existence, developed a wisdom architecture capable of governing the power it continues to accumulate. The Watchers transferred the technology. The technology built the hierarchy. The hierarchy built the Megamachine. The Megamachine built the bomb. The bomb built the clock. And the clock, right now, at this exact moment in history, stands at 90 seconds to a threshold that the antediluvian world crossed once before. It did not survive the crossing. Here is the irony that the entire 6,000-year arc of this story has been building toward, and it is not a comfortable one. Azazel was punished for his transgression. The Enochian texts are explicit on this. He was bound, hands and feet, and cast into the darkness of a desert place called Dudael, buried beneath rocks, face covered, forced to wait in isolation until the day of judgment, when he would be cast into the fire. His punishment, in the cosmological framework of the texts, is commensurate with his crime. He unlocked a door he was not authorized to unlock. He transferred a technology that was under containment protocol for reasons the species on the receiving end could not yet understand, and he was removed from the equation. But here is what the punishment does not contain: a mechanism for removing the knowledge he transferred. The humans who received it kept it, passed it forward, refined it, extended it, built civilizations on it, destroyed civilizations with it, built new ones on the ruins. The flood came and reset the biological record. It did not reset the metallurgical memory. The survivors walked off the ark and built a forge. And every generation since has inherited both the fire and the conviction that they are finally the ones equipped to manage it responsibly. Azazel sits in Dudael. The curriculum runs free. The punishment in this light is not a story about divine justice. It is a story about the gap between closing a source and containing a contagion. You can silence the teacher. You cannot unlearn what has already been learned. The deepest structural irony of this story is that the entity who transmitted the technology was imprisoned for doing so, while the species that received it was allowed to continue, which means that the cosmos, whatever you believe it to be, made a specific calculation at a specific moment and decided that the more dangerous of the two parties, the one with the knowledge and no wisdom architecture to govern it, was the one worth preserving. Azazel was contained. We were not. And we have been living inside the consequences of that decision ever since, building ever larger versions of the machine that his curriculum made possible, each iteration more powerful than the last, each one accompanied by the same sincere assurance that this time, finally, the wisdom has caught up with the capability. Think about the last time you watched the news and felt the specific sensation of a civilization moving faster than anyone inside it could track. The feeling that the systems are too large, the decisions too consequential, the feedback loops too compressed for any human institution to adequately supervise. That sensation is not a modern anxiety. It is not a product of social media or political polarization, or the pace of technological change in the 21st century. It is the oldest feeling in the species. It is the feeling the Nephilim warlords were experiencing when they sent Mahaway to find Enoch and ask what the dreams meant. It is the feeling Oppenheimer was trying to articulate when he said the physicists had known sin. It is the feeling that every civilization that has ever built something larger than its own wisdom could govern eventually arrives at, standing at the edge of what it has created, looking out at the scale of it, and understanding, too late, or possibly just in time, that the fire it is holding is not entirely under control. You have just heard the history of that fire, from the first furnace to the last bomb, from the lame smith breathing arsenic in the forges of the Chalcolithic, to the scientists breathing recycled air in the sealed facilities where the current generation of the Megamachine does its work. It is, depending on how you hold it, either the story of how a species climbed toward power it was never meant to have, or the story of how a species was given a tool it was never equipped to use, and has spent 6,000 years trying to figure out what to do with the gift, before the gift decides for them. Here is the question the story leaves you with, and it does not have a comfortable answer. Enoch was preserved. The righteous man, the one who walked with whatever force is responsible for the containment protocol, was taken before the flood, translated out of the world before the reset. The flood came. Everything else drowned. And in the traditions that preserved his memory, Enoch's distinguishing characteristic was not moral perfection. It was that he refused the curriculum. He did not pick up the sword. He did not apply the Kohl to his eyelids. He did not build the machine. He walked away from the forge. So here is what this story is really asking you. If you were standing at the threshold Enoch stood at, if you could see what the fire produces when a species holds it without the wisdom to govern it, if you knew with the clarity that the flood gave, that the technology and the hierarchy and the machine it generates will eventually demand a price that civilizations pay in total, would you put down the curriculum? Or would you decide, as every civilization before you has decided, that the fire is worth the cost, that the power is worth the risk, that this time your hands are steady enough to hold it. There is no version of that question where one answer is clearly correct. There is only the version where you have to decide, right now, which of those two things you actually believe. And in the deciding, discover which of those two worlds you are already living in, and whether, looking honestly at the clock, you think the margin is enough. The figure of Enoch does not disappear from the tradition when he is translated out of the Antediluvian world. He resurfaces in texts that were not included in this account, in traditions that the mainstream record has suppressed with the same systematic thoroughness it applied to the Book of Giants, in a role that makes the entire antediluvian story look, in retrospect, like a prologue to something larger and stranger and far more relevant to the moment you are living in right now. What Enoch was translated into and what he was given in that translation, and why the tradition that preserved his memory across 2,000 years of theological suppression considered him the most dangerous figure in the entire celestial hierarchy, is a thread that has been running through everything you just heard without ever fully surfacing. It is still running, and the only way to understand where it leads is to follow it all the way to the end.